The story of the UK is an economy that has got real momentum.
What is broken can be repaired. What is ruined can be rebuilt.
UK inflation is becoming much more homegrown.
We have huge potential as an economy in the UK.
This is a time to tell Israel there is a path to peace.
Our plan for the British economy is working, but the work is not done.
Hello, you're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Happy New Year. Welcome to the programme. Happy election year, Caroline. Are you excited?
I am really excited. Is that ridiculous?
No, I think it's quite good. And happily, at least if we think about it in that terms, then I don't have to think about one of my most hated parts of this year, which is New Year's resolutions.
Really?
There's no worse time of the year to decide to completely change your life and make it better, in my view, than the depths of winter.
Listen, I think everybody hates New Year's resolutions now. So everyone kind of finds them just an annoyance.
I think I hate talking about them more than I actually
Really?
hate the idea of it.
Well,
anyway.
look, I have developed one weird habit. Can I make an odd confession? Which is that this is like the only time of year that I peak at my pension.
Oh, that's quite productive.
It is. I can only face it once a year.
Okay.
So basically, if the pension pot has grown, I can give myself a nice pat on the back at the start of the year.
But not buy yourself something.
Yeah, no. Exactly. And think how sensible I am. I know that sounds awful. Also, though, if the pension pot is smaller than I had expected, it just means that I get a kick up the backside to work a bit harder in the year ahead.
That's very interesting. Of course, we're thinking about this in the context of the New Year's speeches that were made both by Rishi Sunak and by Keir Starmer as well. Let's take a listen to some of Rishi Sunak's, who made his New Year's resolution very upbeat.
So my New Year's resolution is to keep driving forward. Inflation is set to fall further, cutting the cost of living for everyone. And we're not stopping there. We're going further to grow our economy by reducing debt, cutting taxes and rewarding hard work, building secure supplies of energy here at home, backing British business and delivering world-class education. And we're taking decisive action to stop the boats and break the business model of the criminal gangs.
So that was Rishi Sunak. Yes, sounding very positive. This was just the New Year's message. So we actually get the full kind of New Year's speech, politically laying out the groundwork for the year ahead.
Yes, stay tuned.
Later in the week. This was just a kind of a little taster, I suppose. I mean, it does feel a little bit like we're at the start of the week and we have the same cycle, the same news cycle that we had at the end of last year, because all the headlines are about immigration, about what the government intends to do, everything that we were talking about before Christmas. I mean, we'll have more on the immigration story in and of itself with Stuart Biggs a bit later on in the programme. But then this year is going to be a year, as you say, like no other, because there are just elections everywhere.
Yeah, not only, of course, here as we're expecting in the UK, the US, India, the European elections are in May as well. A survey by Delta Poll saying the British public want an election as soon as possible. 2/3 are saying they want to vote in either spring or summer of this year. So perhaps if the Prime Minister is considering holding out for longer, he might be swayed by the idea that the British public do want to go to the polls. Yeah,
Rishi Sunak's got a lot to prove beyond just sort of driving onwards, as he was saying. And this year it's also really about, I suppose, how much of a political tactician he's going to show himself to be, as opposed to kind of quite managerial with the 5 pledges.
Yeah, well, speaking of managers, Keir Starmer seems to have settled on a winning format for his New Year's message. See if you can figure it out. Here's 2023.
2023 has been a year of pride and achievement for the Lionesses, yet again so close to doing an unprecedented double. And of course, a year when our country stepped into a new era, with a new king, King Charles III, crowned in the spring. It has also been another tough year economically for millions of people.
So that's this year's New Year's message. Let's go back in time to a year previously.
I'd like to wish you a happy new year. 2022 was the year when football finally came home, with the Lionesses' triumph in the summer. And the year when, in September, we were united in grief for the passing of Queen Elizabeth II. However, for millions of people across our country, it's been another very tough year.
And then what about 2021 then? For those of you playing along at home, have a listen to Keir Starmer.
I hope you've had a happy and a safe Christmas. This year, of course, like the one before it, has been really tough for all of us. And for us football lovers, we'll be cheering on our team in the World Cup later this year.
Well, look, I mean, Keir Starmer has obviously decided that he's got a note to strike. I mean, he is a football fan, so
yes.
Good for him. There is an authenticity in that as well.
Well, football, finance and monarchy, that's it.
Yeah.
Three years in a row.
Staples of British society, surely.
Yeah, winning format.
But a big testing year for him as well. I mean, his New Year's message is I suppose, mainly probably going to be vote for me, in the hopes that the polls will bear true and that he will manage to go into an election and fight one with the results that people are saying now in opinion polls they want.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, voters do like consistency, so that's sort of perhaps a good thing. On the other hand, they also do seem to want to know more. I mean, just look at the leader column in the Times today, which says that Keir Starmer, quote, owes the voters greater candour. So perhaps, yeah, everybody's going to be put to the test in a potential general election year.
Yeah, look, I'm going to be looking forward to getting the details of some of those big policy speeches that are coming later in the week as well. I spent many years covering French politics, and I always actually really liked this time of year because there's a New Year's Eve address, which is usually about 10 minutes, so quite a lot longer than these messages that you get. And then the whole of the month of January, you have the French president go out and speak to different sectors of society. Whereas, I mean, obviously you get a lot of, repeated rhetoric and messages that you've heard before as well, but you did get a few policy ideas in there as well. So you did generally feel when you got to the end of January, you just slightly better idea about what the government's direction was and some of the big policies than you might have necessarily had at the start of January.
Yeah, also I think that we're seeing more of these, I think, in a more splintered and fractured media landscape. It does seem like every politician, I mean, Xi Jinping in China, his kind of staple of the year is a New Year's Eve address. And so if you're trying to get your message out there, saying it again and again in as many different formats as possible, some people hope is the winning formula.
Well, let's think about one of the big ideas in the past that's been presented to boost the British economy, and one from Boris Johnson to make post-Brexit Britain into a space superpower. Bloomberg's been speaking to officials and executives in the industry who say that the ambitions are being undermined by political disarray and weak investment. Let's bring in our tech reporter Tom Seal for more. Tom, great to have you with us. What's gone wrong then with the plan for Galactic Britain?
Great name, isn't it? It's a mixture of bigger problems with the City of London, which we've seen with the listing of ARM in New York, and general anxiety about capital drift to other places, Brexit and political outcomes of that, meaning that ministers aren't in post for long enough, they have different priorities. So I think with this, a key example here is that Boris Johnson loved space. He loved the idea of a sort of monument to himself in space, according to his advisor Dominic Cummings. Then Liz Truss had no time for it. She scrapped half of his work. Sunak's had to bring it back. It's this chopping and changing, which is no good for industry, which needs, it's very complicated, needs a lot of cooperation, needs long-term planning.
Okay, but it's not just about politics, is it? I mean, you mentioned the cash, the money, the funding.
Absolutely. Space is really expensive, and the only name in space, as far as most people are concerned, is Elon Musk. You look at SpaceX, we've reported it's one of the most valuable private companies in the world, 180 billion perhaps. Meanwhile, the only other active rival to that, the UK has a stake in it. It's a company called OneWeb. It's now a diluted stake because a French company has effectively, merged with it. They say merger, but it's headquartered in Paris. It's got a French chief executive, and that's worth 2 billion euros at the moment. So that kind of access to deep-pocketed US long-sighted optimistic investors is also lacking for sure.
What's the potential here? What could this industry provide to a prosperous post-Brexit Britain?
Well, it's partly we've lost certain things as a consequence of Brexit. So we were part of a big EU programme called Galileo, which is basically the EU's version of GPS, the thing that underpins your Google Maps and all your deliveries, and much more sophisticated things, including kind of banking, timing, and military operations. We've been kicked out of the inner part of that because of Brexit, so now we're critically reliant on just GPS, which is owned by the US. And GPS, you can jam it. It's actually not that hard to jam it if you're dedicated to doing that. So we've kind of cut various strings, and we haven't got replacements lined up. So part of the reporting showed that the UK has now started developing a crisis plan. What happens if GPS goes down? It costs the economy over £1 billion a day. Meanwhile, there's kind of new services that have immense promise in space, and the UK wants to have a toehold in that. Observation for greenhouse gases, using that for even just measuring companies' commitments so they're not greenwashing. All of this is kind of a really emerging area.
So what do you think then the space industry, this kind of emerging and quite thriving to some people's view industry, actually needs from government and from potentially the next government if we're going into an election?
I think consistency. I think the industry would, you might expect them to say this, they would like more money. You look at some other states, obviously the US pumps way more money into its space sector. SpaceX, as the key example again, benefits from large Department of Defense contracts and various supports. The UK did make this unusual move to spend $500 million buying a stake in OneWeb, but it's kind of stopped there, and it doesn't seem to be pumping any more money into that. That's kind of small fry once you zoom out and look at some of these other companies. So yeah, consistency, more money, and I think it's just confusing about how we're going to work in these international bodies post-Brexit. So with the EU has requirements over third countries that aren't part of the EU, and it's quite muddy about how that's going to play out.
Okay, Tom, thank you so much for being with us and for your reporting. Really fascinating piece. That is our tech reporter, Tom Seal.
Well, let's get the view now of one of the British investors in the space industry. James Brugger is Chief Investment Officer and co-founder of Seraphim Space. He joins us now. James, great to have you with us. Is then political disarray weighing on the ambitions for the space industry in the UK?
Look, I think there's a lot of negativity and angst writ large as it pertains to Britain's place in the world post-Brexit, and I think some of the commentary on the space sector is probably reflective of some of those broader challenges. So I certainly think the difficulties that the space sector have are real, but I'm not sure they're necessarily that specific to space as compared to the broader challenge of Britain finding its feet on the world stage post-Brexit.
Okay, so what's been your experience of interacting with the government on this? When there are such, big ambitions, such big goals for it as stated by government.
Well, firstly, worth noting that the British government, through the British Business Bank, is the largest investor in Seraphim Space Investment Trust, our listed vehicle, by virtue of having previously backed the world's first private space fund that preceded our listing. So it would be churlish of me to suggest that we haven't had significant amounts of government support over now quite a long time horizon, that I do think is reflective of the broader recognition in government of the strategic importance of the space sector to the UK. More recently, there have obviously been a range of government initiatives, both space-specific and more generally, that are, I think, positive indicators of future prospects. So areas around space sustainability, I think, is an area that the UK has identified that it can carve out global leadership. And I think that's the criticality from our perspective. The UK needs to focus on where it can win out globally rather than becoming inward-looking and perhaps focusing more on sort of sovereign capabilities. We need to be able to make an impact on the world stage in order for the sector to really deliver on the promise and the hope that government has.
James, is it a problem then that the UK doesn't do a lot of, frankly, the sexy bit of going to space, which is the rocket launches, the stuff that all of the TV networks around the world cover and therefore gets lots of attention? We do less of that.
Well, we do. There are obviously very few countries around the world that do rocket launch, certainly of human space flight. And I think it would be a challenge realistically for the UK to ever stand shoulder to shoulder with the likes of the US and the budgets that the likes of NASA have. So I don't know how I feel about that, frankly. I think it's an exciting development for space launch from UK soil to be a realistic prospect in the near term. How sizable can that become? I think realistically, it's only going to be smaller satellites that are ever launched from the UK. I'd be very surprised if we're actually launching astronauts from UK soil. So I think development of those capabilities is important, but it comes back to my earlier point around playing to global opportunity versus more localized sovereign capability. Our preference at Seraphim would almost always be around playing to opportunities to develop global leadership rather than necessarily just replicating capabilities that already exist elsewhere.
Is that understood by players in government, that it's not a case of necessarily, as you say, there being a sovereign case for building a space industry, but building it in an international context? And is there an appetite within, I suppose, officialdom to kind of create those sort of international partnerships?
Well, I think there is, and I think you can play to both of those opportunities. So what do I mean by that? So I think, look, generally it's part of the sort of UK national psyche. We're probably not particularly good at trumpeting our successes. The reality is, certainly in terms of the more innovation end of the spectrum in terms of the space sector, the UK punches massively above our weight. We are third behind only China and the US in terms of the number of space startups that have been founded, or indeed the amount of capital and number of companies that are getting funded. So you point to me any other sector that from a UK perspective, we're third behind the two global superpowers of US and China. And I think that success is recognized in government. The development of space clusters that we've seen, the fact that places like Glasgow, for example, are manufacturing almost as many satellites every year as any other particular location anywhere in the world. So I think there is a recognition around that, but equally there is a recognition from government's perspective as they perceive it of the importance of developing sovereign capability, not just, I should add, for the capability itself, but for the supply chain and the ecosystem that it develops. So having the manufacturing and engineering base in the UK that will enable us to then have the foundation to go on and deliver global success.
And yet, space, like a whole raft of other industries in the UK, is looking, in some senses, for direction, for the sorts of policies, consistent long-term policies from government to sort of build on success and grow it. What do you think, would be the most important thing in terms of the next 5 years for the industry from government as we go into a general election year where we may get a big change in government? Who knows, looking at the polls. What do you need from government to try to build on this success?
Well, I think like any sector, what you want is clarity and stability. And I think it's fair to say that just looking more broadly at the UK political landscape, that's been in somewhat short supply over the last 5 years for reasons that I'm sure your listeners are fully aware of. You're right to call out the UK election and what that might mean for the sector. What do I see as being the most important thing? So again, given Seraphim's focus more on earlier stage and growth opportunities, I think the biggest change that we need to see is government actually procuring from smaller companies. There is a reasonable level of support in terms of grants, but what we want to see is the government as a customer. That would give huge reassurance to investors such as ourselves and others internationally to put their full weight behind the UK's most promising space startups. So I think that would be very high up my list. And I think likewise, putting in place policies to back up talk around potential areas of global leadership, such as space sustainability, where there's been a lot of talk over recent years. Obviously mirrored in King Charles's recent space charter. I'd love to see some firm action around there that provides a pathway for the UK to really become a global recognized leader in an area that we believe is extremely important to both the space sector, but also the broader world.
Okay, James Ruger, Chief Investment Officer and co-founder of Seraphim Space, thank you very much for joining us.
So, from space to boats, the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak says that his government has made progress on stopping the boats. The PM pointed out the new Home Office data, which says that the number of migrant crossings across the English Channel has actually dropped for the first time in 5 years. Critics, though, including some of his own MPs, are disputing those figures. So, joining us now to pass the data is our UK government editor, Stuart Biggs. Happy New Year, Stuart. And the statistics causing quite a stir in Westminster. Why?
It really goes back to the pledge at the start of last year that Sunak made to stop the boats. And of course, within that pledge, there's dispute over whether it means get the boats down to zero or whether it means, make a big dent in the numbers. And so right from the start of this pledge, there's a sort of row over what it should mean or does mean or will mean. And so then you fast forward 12 months and he's got his chunk of numbers that's less than the previous year. So it's progress. If you're the Prime Minister, you're coming out saying, right, we've made progress. It's not done yet, but look, we're on the right path. And that's really the message he wants to get out there. But there's all sorts of ways to show how it's not all is not quite as it seems, and one of them is the dispute over the weather and whether the number of crossings that were doable last year was less, and so that
this is the idea that the weather was worse in towards the end of the year, and as a result, there fewer boats made the crossings, which sort of helped the Prime Minister on his way to being able to claim that crossings were down, although they were down, but to explain it.
They were actually down, and the reasons why are important, and that there'll be a dispute over, who gets to claim the credit, and that's what it's about. And
yeah.
But the other aspect of this is that migration experts make is that last year, they did a returns deal with Albania that is regarded as being a big deterrent from a large percentage of the people making the crossings, and of course but the returns deal is a one-off gain, and so you from the Prime Minister's perspective. So therefore, the question is, how do you continue to make progress through this year?
Which is what I wanted to point out. So the drop has been a drop of 36%. So it is a very significant drop in the number of small boats crossing the channel. And so again, you can pass the figure and say, well, is that all explained simply by bad weather in December? But again, you point to the idea that it was actually the one-off deal with Albania that helped the most. Yes, the critics say that this wasn't anything to do, for example, with outlier policies like Rwanda, but actually to do with more cooperation with our closest neighbour France and Albania. So that's also very tricky for the Prime Minister.
And it's not where he wants the argument to be, or the discussion to be. The idea that there's a certain sort of political push from Downing Street and from the government to sort of make this about Rwanda gains, hardline policy, blocking, stopping, being tough, and that argument is not suited to the evidence of cooperation, reaching deals, working with allies, and that's that may be the reason why, or it looks to be a major reason why he's making progress, but it's not where he wants the discussion and the narrative to be. And so there's all sorts of ways where this release that we've had overnight doesn't work precisely in the way that he'd like, even though it's from his perspective, it's a positive release.
But does that set you up then for the potential for, if things move the other direction? That's one of the warnings from one of the associations of immigration officials as well, is that, these numbers could go back up just as easily.
Yes, and this is why even people close to Sunak have said that they were uncomfortable with the pledge to begin with, that it was such a difficult target to meet, whether it's down to zero or whether it's significant progress. Even it was such a difficult target to meet, and then why sort of present the government around that core pledge when it could go either way, and was very much not something the government could do itself to make happen. There's so many external factors that the government is now sort of subject to in terms of whether it works for the next few months. And so not everyone around Sunak is particularly happy about putting this at the heart of the government's agenda.
Yeah. Stuart, thank you so much for being with us and for going through, yes, the difficulty of understanding the statistics and what they mean for politics. Our UK government editor, Stuart Biggs. I think this goes back to the point that we made at the start of the show. The challenge is really for the Prime Minister as politician versus manager in some ways. And that's where the statistics and how you set the goalposts is so very, very difficult in this political environment.
Well, that's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe and give it 5 stars so other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by James Wilcock. Our audio engineer was Mufa Hussain. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. We'll be back with more tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.